Okay, everybody. This is our last Q&A for the weekend. And thank you, Kate, for staying with us while our members of the Assembly were deliberating. And thank you for making yourself available for the questions to Kate and to Eddie and to Alison, who's busy with her sticker book over in the corner. So now I'd like to open the floor again to some questions, and we'd love to get the diversity of voices as well, even though we do love our big personalities too. So if there are others now that might have questions to ask from the tables, wonderful, great. So Connor has a microphone for you.
Hi everyone, my name is Jenny, and we feel that short-termism is one of the biggest threats facing the regeneration of these policies. So we have a bit of a political green card here saying we believe that the term of Secretary-Generals should move towards 10 years so that it allows change to happen within a better, longer cycle, and that the changeover never happens, like that it happens in the middle of the political election cycles so that it won't be influenced by politics.
Great, very, very pointed. Who would like to take those points? Or everybody? Yeah. Eddie, are you happy to go with that?
Yeah, it's. If I start maybe, but Kate might have something interesting to say here as well, because I mean the term of a government is a massive question, right? And you can see other countries do it different ways. Italy, I think, has a Senate that would have a much longer time horizon than the actual government itself. But again, they're not getting the balance right. And you often wonder, is the nature of politics to get pulled into the, the firefighting, as I said, of what is the biggest issue today? I'm not sure there is a perfect system or a perfect term for government to get it exactly right. I don't know.
Thanks, Eddie. Kate, would you like to speak to that question?
I'll just add a quote that I love from the American historian Howard Zinn. He says, politics is what happens between elections, in the sense that, of course, the election cycle is massively important, but it's how democracy actually is held to account and alive and deliberative in between that really, really matters as well. So I'm not close enough to your political system to be able to talk about the specific length of terms, but it's about, however long it is, holding that account. I personally, I'm in a country where I really want an election right now, right, in the UK. So the idea of this government now being here for 10 years, so it's the quality of how the democratic decision-making comes about. And I think the rise of deliberative democracy, like you're doing right now, is a really important part of improving that quality.
Thanks, Kate. Art?
Just on the issue of the length of time of governments, there is no obligation on a government to last 5 years. It will last for as long as it will. I mean, governments break up. We have a history in this country of coalitions falling apart and elections being. We don't have fixed-term governments, so we do have legislation which says that it can not be any longer than 5 years. So it might be something that you'd like to look at or perhaps consider, but the legislation, there's enough wriggle room there to allow for much shorter governments, but I think you might be looking for much longer ones. And the issue about the term of a Secretary-General, I mean, it's an interesting one. It's 7 years right now, but many of the Secretary-Generals do have contracts which have rolled over, and some of them last for considerably longer than that, because the age of Secretary-Generals is becoming younger and younger right now. And after 7 years, to say to someone, well, listen, thank you for your service and off you go, when someone might be 45, is something to bear in mind as well, because we are losing a lot of energy, a lot of experience from when we lose Secretary-Generals like that as well. So perhaps it's something else just to consider. Thank you.
I just want to add to sorry, Eddie. Eddie, go first. Sorry.
Yeah, if you don't mind. I mean, the nature of the question is brilliant, though, because one thing you would like to see in terms of just budgetary policy is a much longer time horizon. So the government has kind of constantly flipped between, 1 year budgets to maybe up to 3 years to maybe 4 years, the odd time 5 years. But generally, the budget is a 1 year ahead plan. After that, it's not realistic at all. And what you would love to see is like proper planning in the civil service, where it's taking a much longer term horizon and having to force itself to really think through challenges that it's going to face in 10 years' time, 20 years' time. Because then things like I said, the aging of the population, it'll have to think about it today rather than kind of kicking it down the road. And same with biodiversity loss, same with climate change transition issues. These things aren't really being dealt with today, and we can see that the plans aren't costed at all.
Thanks, Eddie. And maybe that's something specifically, Jenny, that we can address in members' recommendations. Did you want to respond?
We actually did have a solution that didn't cost money to that. We were thinking that we should use the principles of agile technology and lean, and use the fact that we do have secondments, and where you have expertise sitting in the Department of Environment that needs to go into planning, that could be, so we push secondments more between those key departments. It doesn't cost any money, they're on the same salary. So, you know, the people at the top may change, but that you're allowing that expertise at no cost to cross between to tackle the issue.
Great. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, table. Is it 9? Yeah, thank you. There's a question at the back from table 13, and there's a question at table 4. So we'll take 13, 4, 3. Okay.
Paul is my name. A word that came up in our discussion here was the word growth, or growth, as some would have it. We didn't hear it mentioned earlier, but we wondered what it actually means. Is it purely finance or GDP money, or could the definition be broadened to include quality of life, biodiversity, other parameters, perhaps?
I think Kate will be the natural respondent to this question, but you know, just I find this very interesting as well. And we often use GDP when we mean growth. It's kind of an imperfect substitute for what we probably think about when we mean an economy, society growing and thriving. The reason we use it is because it tends to be highly correlated with things like health outcomes and better education and things like this. But it's not perfect. And there was a big move in the last kind of decade by, among others, Joseph Stiglitz and Nicolas Sarkozy to push this kind of idea of a broader measure of how we could think about growth. And I think you're thinking along the right lines. Now, hopefully, they don't have to be unrelated to each other. The big long-run driver of growth is basically technological progress and adapting and improving productivity, how we do more with less, okay? So if we think that's the big long-run driver of growth, and generally economists do, then it doesn't have to be a case of, you know, totally ruining the environment. It could be something, or ruining biodiversity. It could be that we improve how we use and interact with the world. And I'd like to hear Kate's thoughts on this as well. But I think if you accept that kind of basic principle that technology is the big driver of growth and how we do things and productivity, then I don't see how it has to be exclusive of other goals.
Thanks, Eddie. Kate?
So, yeah, great question. Thank you, Paul. The very big question, I think. And I'm going to quickly just, if I can, quickly just share my screen, because if that still works. I'm sharing a quote that I actually wrote out yesterday, because the UK government is now saying growth, 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 growth. This is a quote from Donella Meadows. She was one of the mothers of systems thinking, of thinking about the complexity of everything. And she said, growth is one of the stupidest purposes ever invented by any culture. We've got to have an enough. And when anyone calls for growth, we should always ask, and this is what I invite you, always ask, growth of what? And why? And for whom? And who pays the cost? And how long can it last? And what's the cost to the planet? And how much is enough? And I think those are really important questions. As Eddie says, yes, when people say the word growth in an economic conversation, they mean an increase in the value, the financial value of goods and services that have been sold in the economy in a year. That's what we call economic growth. And I'll agree partly with Eddie that it does correlate partly with health and education, but actually some of the richest countries in terms of GDP in the world do not have the best health and education outcomes at all. Think of the US and actually the UK. I mean, we are really have much higher levels of inequality and social deprivation and health and education outcomes than we should, given our levels of income. So these things come apart, especially at higher levels of income. And growth for whom? Whose income is growing? And at what cost to the planet, which is, of course, a big question here. So when I drew the donut diagram, which I'll pull up here again, here it is, the very purpose of this was to move us in our minds away from thinking that the metric of success is endless GDP growth, which is what I was raised on as an economist trained, is what we always hear government economists talking about, or government politicians, growth, growth, growth. Nothing that we love thrives by growing forever. Think of your kids, they grow and they grow up. The plants in your garden, the trees, they grow and they grow up and they mature. So this is the big existential question. I believe that societies and humanity on this delicately balanced planet, we will succeed not by creating economies that try to grow forever. At some point, they must grow up and thrive. And so this donut diagram aims to say this is a vision of thriving, right? It's a balance where we meet the needs of all people, but we do that within the means of the living planet. And an economy that's set on growing endlessly will literally double and double and double. It cannot belong on this living planet. Now, at the same time, when we are in crisis, and when we have a cost of living crisis, and when we have people living in very, really deprived circumstances, we need to grow their incomes, right? We need to focus on ensuring we get those people. We need to grow renewable energy for sure and bring down the fossil fuels. We need to grow regenerative agriculture and bring down the old degenerative agriculture. So definitely some things need to grow. And that's what we need to start, spread and amplify. And some things we need to let go of and leave behind. So I'll leave it there with that thought. Paul, thank you for bringing it. It is, I think, the ultimate question of what is the shape of progress? And I think we're moving away from a 20th century that's obsessed with growth. We must learn now to thrive. And that's much easier said than done. And I think as a citizens' assembly, where you can step back from the immediacy of policy and pleasing the papers and pleasing the electorate with the promise of growth, I think you can speak to a much bigger vision of surely as a nation, our goal must be to thrive.
Thank you, Kate. A thriving economy versus a growing economy, and thinking about that differently. Now, we have two questions. I'm going to take them in a row, and they're from No Bias. Oh, there's lots more questions, but these hands were up first. Sorry. Was there someone from this table? From table 4? Yeah. And I'll take Edward's question then.
Hi, Patrick. We had great difficulty coming up with any ideas on taxation, but I think we went back to Kate's presentation on what's been mentioned before, that you have to put forward a vision, and with that vision you request the ring fencing of funds, and if possible in a long-term manner. Now, I don't know if that's possible within the current political setup. However, it has happened before, and it happened with education in the 60s. And it's happened recently with COVID, where funds were found. So therefore, we need to emphasize the importance of it and what the vision is and where we're going.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm going to come back to that. Edward, can I take your question as well? Denise, if you don't mind.
Hi, Kate. This is a question to you regarding your donut economics. And I really like how you structured and showed how the ideal system should work. But what concerns me is the outer band. Is it fixed in one place? Because we know that human population is growing, constantly growing, and we have to squeeze everybody into that green donut. Does it mean we have to then, as Hillary said earlier, control population size? Or should we figure out other ways of staying within that band?
Thank you, Edward. Now, I think it was table 8 and table 12. We haven't heard a lot from them, so I'm going to take those questions. Conor, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, everybody. We're concerned with the derelict and underutilised inner cities and towns. Do you know of any examples internationally where they have successfully regenerated urban towns, sites, and using brown land as good examples for us here in Ireland?
Great question, and we'll be looking specifically at urban in coming weekends, but we'll address it here. And was there a question at table 12? I thought I saw another hand. Great.
Hi, my name's Joe. So I was just wondering, so we live in a profit-oriented society, and it's informed by post-Keynesian theories as far as I'm aware. So I was just wondering, should we move towards, as Professor Richard Wolff said, away from Malthusian profit motives and more towards theories that we already know exist, and instead ignore the invisible hand, as so it's been called by Smith?
Thank you, Joe. You are obviously our theoretician, which is great. But we may need to pause that one right now because I'd have to read up before we dealt properly with it. But I might just go to Patrick's question first about taxation and how do we go about ring fencing a fund for biodiversity to put it on that scale of COVID's emergency, we'll get the money. Biodiversity is an emergency, will we get the money? Eddie?
Well, so one part of the question was, right, ring fencing, this idea that, you kind of say, well, can we kind of say there's a revenue here linked to some activity, maybe climate related or something like that. Can we ring fence it? The government is very unlikely to do that, right? You can see there tends to be an aversion to that in the civil service. And I don't know why, but I guess it's kind of, you're tying your hands, right? You're saying that we're never going to use that money for something else. They don't like doing that. They like the flexibility, right? But in terms of another way of thinking of it is, could you set aside a budget for these types of things? You could, of course. And again, it goes back to this kind of point I made about planning for these things. Like, if you have a long-term vision for what you want, a long-term plan, and you put in place very clear costings of it, there's no reason you couldn't kind of push the discussion in that direction of allocating that funding. The other thing I didn't say is that, we always talk about the budgets for the next few years. The next 10 years maybe might be even a stretch, but the next 3 years. We never talk about the money that's already being spent and the subsidies that are already being given for various activities. So the CSO has really good data on how much of Ireland's subsidies go towards fossil fuels, to activities that are kind of perhaps bad for the climate and environment. And I think that's something the Assembly could be thinking about as well is, well, what are we doing today as a government with its €100 billion expenditure budget and with its tax policies that are actually good or bad, and where do they fall in terms of Kate's diagram in terms of making an impact?
Thanks, Eddie. Spend what we have already might be an easier way than ask for more. Kate, can I bring two questions to you at once? So Edward's question about the growing population and how does that really work with the donut? And to your knowledge, are there towns in other countries where dereliction of certain areas has actually been tackled in a useful way?
Great. Can I add one thing, though, to Patrick's question? So there are things governments can do also that doesn't take money. So there was a question about ring fencing. I just want to remind us that there are things they can do. For example, I'm going to give you an example. The City of Amsterdam, they said, a few years ago, they said, by 2030, there will be no fossil fuel vehicles in this city, no boats in the canals, no cars, no buses, no trucks. We're telling you now, we're giving you a long, loud, legal message that in 2030, they'll be out. It doesn't cost them money to make that clarity, but it sends a very big signal to everybody who wants to do business and live and work and move in Amsterdam. Over the next 10 years, you've got to change. You can do the same with banning damaging pesticides. We're going to have only life-friendly chemistry, transforming the economy. So there are messages the government can give now, setting that real clarity of transformation that sets in motion all sorts of other sectors, investments. So I just want to make sure that's on the table as well as thinking about budgets and ring fencing. Jenny said, what can we do without spending money? Those kinds of clear messages for the future, I think, are a really important part of making change begin now. So to the question on population, let me answer this one briefly. It's a really important one. Okay, human population, as there are more of us worldwide, it takes more energy and resources to provide food and health and education and housing and transport for everybody. So yes, this circle starts getting bigger and bigger. Now, planet Earth, she's not listening to that. She's tending to all of the species, and she's got this balance she's been in for 10,000 years. There is only so much carbon we can put in the climate until we shift it and we break it down. Only so much fertilizer we can put in lakes and rivers until we kill off aquatic life. Only so much water we can withdraw and land we transform until we destroy biodiversity. So we have to adjust to the reality. This is the ultimate reality of life on Earth. It's not in finance, it's in the metrics of the living world. Yes, it means we need to stabilize the size of the human population. We are already many, and we need to stop growing and we need to plateau. And that means we need to think about the size of every family. And the good news, this is a good news story, we know how to do that. The most powerful way to slow and stabilize the growth of the human population is to invest in child health, make sure babies survive the world over, invest in girls' education, women's empowerment, so that women are empowered to take choices over their own bodies, over their own health. They then choose, in country after country after country, they choose to have not 7 children, but more like 2 children. So invest in getting everybody out of this deprivation, and you'll find that family size comes down. And each one of us can, even if we only are having 2 children, think, how do we live? How do I eat? How do I travel? How do I heat my home? What do I expect? And what resources am I using? So we each need to transform. That's why we need our industries to transform, so that when we eat, we're eating well and we're not destroying biodiversity. So we need the industrial systems to make our own lifestyles make sense. Lastly, I'll come to the question about derelict places, and I'll give you a very short answer. I'm glad you're going to hear more. I was in Barcelona earlier this year, went there on the train. It was a great journey, and it was an amazing city. They are doing phenomenal transformation in that city. Now, it's obviously a major city, but they had old industrial areas that were just brownfield sites, old industries, and they're doing brilliant city planning, turning it into communities. They're bringing nature back into the city. They're building community in the city. They're building in social housing to make it affordable as they redevelop that sector. So I would definitely say, folks, look at what they're doing in Barcelona. It's very, very inspiring.
Thank you, Kate. We're going to make a note of that. And Joe, I don't mean to ignore the question, but I certainly don't. I don't know how to summarise it, and so I'm going to have to ask you to find the economists on a quiet moment, and they might be able to tackle that for you. Kate, we are so grateful to you for your time today and for your presentation, and equally to Eddie for coming up with Alison from Kerry. So thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you.
Now, we are almost ready, but your evaluation forums are incredibly important to us because it tells us whether or not we did a good job planning this weekend. If we didn't, we will change things for our next meeting. So based on what you say in your evaluation surveys, that will dictate how we go about stuff for the next weekend, okay? So put in your feedback as honestly as you can. So I'm going to give you just 5-10 minutes to do that, and we'll have our wrap up.